Hello, and welcome back to the blog. This is probably the final installment of Interpretive Rants, and this one is going to be on the harmony of the Testaments, okay? Many feel no connection to the Old Testament. In the Bible, we have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament, all right? In the Old Testament, we have all these histories, genealogies, the laws, all these kind of things excuse me, seem to have no connection to us today, especially under Christ and under the New Covenant, all that it says about the difference between the Old and the New. And so it's difficult for us to read and to understand and to connect with. And there are a few different reasons for this. First of all, we in our modern kind of Christianity, we have a misunderstanding of what the gospel is. The good news is the whole redemptive plan of God centered around the person and work of Jesus Christ. But that plan doesn't then discount the Old Testament, but rather reinterprets it anew through the Son of God and His work. For example, imagine if you just read The Return of the King without reading The Fellowship of the Ring or Two Towers in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There would be some things you wouldn't really understand, or really understand the magnitude, or really feel the connection to how important some things happened in the Return of the King, some of those events, okay? And so the more you and so if you read leading up to that, it makes the Return of the King mean a whole lot more when you've read and understood leading up to through the other two books, okay? Not to mention that once you've read the whole trilogy, now you can go back to the first two books and see so many more connections, see so many more developments, and see those developments all over again in light of a completed work, okay? And so it's the same way with the Old Testament, all right? The New Testament wasn't written, and it wasn't, nor was it meant to be read apart from the revelation of God's complete redemptive plan and the part that came before, okay? So secondly, the Old Testament, unfortunately, is not organized chronologically. And this makes the big picture difficult to see, all right? It makes the amazing story leading up to the absolute need for and the greatest gift of the Son of God to the earth. It makes that difficult to see, because it's all kind of organized by types of books instead of organized chronologically. If you read it chronologically, in that context, you see the story leading up to the need for Christ. It makes sense, okay? You see what the prophet said. You see what the history happened. You see all this stuff in context, and you realize the need for Christ. And it makes it so much more powerful, all right? So in that context, the Old Testament both informs the New Testament and gives way more testimony to the New Testament, and is also redefined, as I said before, by it. Another important part of this is that it's difficult for people to separate sometimes the Old Testament from the Old Covenant, all right? The Old Covenant has passed away in light of the New Covenant, all right? The testimony of God's redemptive work in history, though, has not been discounted or diminished in any way. It is still the Old Testament. It is still a testament of who God is. God has not changed. His covenant has changed, and we have been revealed more about Him through Christ, okay? But Christ, Jesus, Paul, Peter, James, all these guys, they actually quote from the Old Testament continually, because again, the Old Testament is still a testimony to God's work and His plan, and it prophesies what is to come. And so without that testimony, there is no Christ, okay? And so it must be pointed out that the writers of the New Testament considered the Old Testament scripture. That was a scripture that they used to teach the New Covenant. They didn't start writing letters and the Gospels till decades later. They were teaching these ideas of the New Covenant and the new creation and all these awesome things that are so powerful in the New Testament. They were teaching these things using the Old Testament, okay? So for us to feel as if the Old Testament is archaic or not applicable to us today is to actually go against the very people who wrote the New Testament and what they believed and what they did, okay? And so it's important to see a harmony between the Old and the New Testament. They both support one another. They both go together as one story, one complete story. And unfortunately, that's difficult for many to see. So hopefully this helps today. All right? Love you guys. Talk to you soon. Peace.